I wanted to talk a little bit about, I could frame this a lot of different ways, and I was thinking, maybe I shouldn't have been thinking, but I was thinking a little bit during the practice. I think I used to frame this topic of stress reduction, stress elimination as kind of a comparison thing. Like, what's better? Would you rather reduce your stress or eliminate it, right? And I think that really my experience with this topic is it's more about like the initial benefits of having a practice and the long-term benefits. And so stress reduction being the initial. And I'm purposefully talking about this as like, kind of cheeky stress reduction, stress elimination. We're talking about benefits and the goal of meditation, which is very non-Buddhist. But hopefully that will all come full circle as we get into it. So mindfulness is very popular these days, and I personally am a really big fan of that. I think the more the merrier. I think there is something very innate and intuitive about being present, and I don't feel like, the Buddha had a monopoly on that idea. I think that he articulated this practice very well. And that it was 2,600 years ago is quite impressive with the amount of description he gave to this practice and how we undertake it and cultivate it. And he also talked a lot about the goal, right? Like that there's a point. There's a reason why we would want to be mindful. And I do think that gets a little convoluted, right? And it's not anyone's fault. I think it's culture and conditioning. So why do we practice mindfulness? I think there's a lot of good reasons. And I do think some are better than others, to be honest. Has mindfulness made me more productive? For sure. Right? Has it made me be able to organize thoughts better? Yes. Has it helped my decision making? Yes. Has it improved my communication at work and being less reactive? Yes. All those things are great. But if that's where I stop, I think I'm selling myself short. And so this is kind of in part to talk about and to reflect for myself, because we're all different, on what are the initial kind of benefits of having a meditation practice, and maybe what are some of the ways that we can lean into the transformational impact that this practice can have in our lives long term. And so it's a little bit of a technical talk. They say sometimes we come into the Dharma in two doorways. One is through the heart and one is through the head. And equally are great doorways. I'm more of a head person myself, and so I've had to develop the heart. I'm less of a sentimental person. The heart practices, that stuff wasn't what appealed to me. And so if you're like me, congratulations. We get a talk that maybe appeals a little bit more to the understanding and wisdom side. And all you heart folks out there, we see you and we love you, and I think in a lot of ways this is also connected, right? So again, we'll get into this, but this actually isn't about intellectual headiness. It's about discernment. It's about clarity. And how much can we verify some of what we're going to talk about today from our own direct experience in our lives? Does that make sense? All right, so stress reduction. I wanted to present kind of two different ways of viewing the practice. And one is kind of initial, and one is upon further investigation, like what we might come to see the practice as down the road or over time. And so initially, I think mindfulness is, if we're going to define it, it's an ability to be present with, aware of, and accepting towards thoughts, emotions, and sensations as they come and go. Does that sound pretty good? I've been doing this a long time. I have a hard time finding a definition I'm completely satisfied with, but I'm like, all right, yeah, that's something like that. To be present, to be aware, and to be accepting. That seems to be three things that mindfulness is helping me with. And presence, being present, means focusing attention on the present experience. In this case, we use sound and breath and body, so that we're not swept away by thoughts. So much of our life is being consumed with future thoughts and past thoughts and a lot of thoughts of the what ifs or the if onlys or the coulda, shoulda, woulda, right? It's just all of this thought that's not really directed towards being present. And so in my experience, and I hope, or I wonder if y'all have had the same, so much of my experience of being human is run by thought. And a lot of times my body's here, but my ability to be present is hard pressed. It's hard to find. So practicing mindfulness will help us to be more present. You hear, phrases like "be here now," right? Very simple, very succinct, and I think very palpable and helpful. If I could just do that, I think a lot of my suffering in life would go away. And if that's all I was going to get out of this, I think my life would be a little bit better, to be more present. So it's an ability to be present. It's also an ability to be aware, right? And so while I'm present, I'm aware of the thoughts and the feelings and the sensations that are happening in the present moment. Right? And one of maybe the first powerful things we experience when you have a meditation practice is there's a difference between being aware of your thought and in it. And we all actually have had that experience, even if you haven't practiced mindfulness. Right? You ever been driving down the road and just tripping about something and just all of a sudden you're like, oh wow, I'm really fucking losing my mind right now. That's actually a pretty powerful moment. It's like I'm not my thought. My mind has a mind of its own, and it's in a really dark place. And although we're still impacted by the emotion of whatever the mind was doing in that moment, it's powerful to not be as impacted by the story, right? And so mindfulness helps us to be aware of our thoughts and our emotions and sensations in the moment. And then also mindfulness helps this very elusive quality of acceptance. I'm a big fan of acceptance, but I hate talking about acceptance because, acceptance is tricky. It's kind of elusive. It's like I think if I accept my experience, then I all of a sudden feel good about it, right? But acceptance is unconditional, at least in the Buddhist world, right? So it means that you can both feel really unpleasant and unhappy with what you're experiencing and be accepting it at the same time. And so that's why it's kind of elusive, but mindfulness helps us with that because for 30 minutes you're going to sit down and the intention at least is you're not going to do anything. Whatever is happening, you're going to just fully be present with it and let it happen. And that's pretty powerful, especially in a culture and society and our own human psychology that's always looking at doing and fixing and solving and figuring out. To have 30 minutes where it's actually the opposite, it's pretty crazy. And then my mind's like, well, how am I going to get anything out of that, right? It's like, oh, that's the problem, shit. Right? And so very simply, mindfulness helps us to be more present, more aware, and more accepting of what's happening right now. And now we're going to kind of walk deeper. I mean, everything I just said, I feel like rings true. But the goal in the Buddha's eyes is to eliminate stress. Not to reduce stress, not to be more productive, more organized, less reactive at work, not to be more focused and better at managing time. The goal is to eliminate suffering. Now, that's pretty intense. Now, if you don't believe that's possible, totally cool. I don't know if I do either. I've been doing this for 10 years, so you don't have to believe in that. But that's what the Buddha is saying. It's very clear. I'll actually read from the sutta called the Satipatthana Sutta, which is the Buddha's teaching on mindfulness. It's literally from his instruction on mindfulness. He says, bhikkhus, which he's talking to us, practitioners, this is the direct path for the purification of beings, for the surmounting of sorrow and lamentation, for the disappearance of dukkha and discontent, for acquiring the true method for the realization of nibbana, namely the four foundations of mindfulness. So before he teaches on what are called the 4 foundations of mindfulness, which are just instructions on how to practice, he says this is the direct path that leads towards the disappearance of dukkha, stress. For the realization of nibbana, which means liberation. And so I'm interested, okay, well, if that's true, how does this practice lead to the disappearance of dukkha, of stress and discontent? And the Buddha is very clear on this too. He doesn't hide anything. It's actually his first teaching, the Four Noble Truths, right there. I respect the Buddha's teaching because he starts with the bad news. He's not like, do you want to find the light in the way? He's like, have you noticed how fucking hard it is to be human? First noble truth, that simple. Has it been hard? He's kind of like asking you a question. And it's interesting because this word truth, some scholars think it was kind of a tongue-in-cheek thing because he uses the word arya, which was a word that was used to kind of talk about purity. And that was popularized in other spiritual traditions at his time, as people would talk about purity. And, you know, basically it was based a lot on your class and based on this idea of metaphysical karma. And basically some people were walking around like more pure than others based on their birth. Right? And so the Buddha is saying, you want purity. Okay, first purity, first truth of purity is dukkha. Is that all of us are subjected to difficulty and stress and suffering. Doesn't matter your class, doesn't matter what you're born into. It's hard. Have you noticed? It's hard. And so what causes that, and how does mindfulness help us to eliminate it? Well, he goes to the second noble truth, and he says the cause of dukkha is tanha. And tanha is a reflexive and insatiable drive towards stimulation, towards satisfaction, and away from displeasure. It's this body and mind innate kind of restlessness. Do you know that feeling? I know that feeling very well. There's a French philosopher named Blaise Pascal that said all human suffering stems from the fact that we can't sit in a room quietly by ourselves. What happens when you sit in a room quietly by yourself? Tanha. That's what the Buddha calls that feeling. You know that feeling? Sitting at the DMV, forgot your phone? You know that feeling? And so there's this, and Melvin Conner, he's a neuroscientist, says that the internal state of our nervous system, or the default mode of our brain, is a vague mixture of anxiety and desire. Right? And if you've been here, you know I like to quote that a lot because it just resonated so much with me. He says it's best described by the phrase, I want, spoken with or without an object for the verb. And so, okay, the Buddha says this is what's causing your stress and dissatisfaction, is that there is this perhaps biological drive towards comfort, and there's a world that is inundated by impermanence. There's no permanent comfort. So you're always stressfully seeking comfort in a world that's ever changing. Does that make sense? It's been my experience. And so it's like, all right, cool, dude. What do we do about that? Intellectually agree with it, philosophically agree with it. Here's where I really respect the Buddha's teaching. He doesn't care about hammering home that idea. He's actually just kind of assuming that you already know what he's talking about. He's like, all right, you're on board. Like, that's been your experience, right? And everyone's like, yeah. And he's like, well, here's the path. Here's what we have to do. And he gives us mindfulness as one aspect of the path. It's not the whole path. But he says it's the direct path. So it's a pretty big part of it. So my question is, well, why am I not automatically always present, aware, and accepting? If mindfulness helps me to be those things, why am I not? There's something, the Buddha is calling tanha, that's always driving my attention away from the present. That's why I'm not present. There's something, the Buddha is calling it tanha, that's causing us to get lost in stimulating and distracting thoughts and feelings. So I'm not aware, I'm lost. There's something, rather than being accepting of the present experience, the Buddha is calling it tanha, that's fueling my reactivity towards the present experience. It's not making it hard for me to accept the present experience. The Buddha is calling that tanha. So one thing to say real quickly, which we don't have a ton of time to get into, is there's actually nothing wrong with tanha. Now, it leads to your dissatisfaction, it leads to stress and suffering for sure, but you can't really get rid of it. You have to kind of cultivate and erode it away. Right? The Buddha says that this path of awakening, of liberation, all this great stuff he talked about, he calls it a gradual path. And he says it's one that must be cultivated. Not believed in, not anything of the conceptual mind. It's something that has to be cultivated. We have to erode tanha. So, mindfulness as stress elimination. In this way, I would say instead of mindfulness being an ability to be present with, aware of, and accepting, I'd say on a deeper level, mindfulness is an ability to focus into, investigate, and allow the direct sensory experience to come and go. So focus into, investigate, and allow. And there's really these kind of three, instead of present, aware, and accepting, there's really these three skills that we're cultivating, we're training in. And they all work together. So we don't have to do them separately, and they all kind of organically happen in meditation. And I told y'all it's a little bit of a technical talk, but this has really helped me over time understand why I am walking my way towards eliminating suffering, if that's even possible. Because I'm sharpening these three specific things. And the first is what we could call concentration, which you may say is actually maybe concentration's the result, but focus is the skill. And now hear me out. Some of y'all are already checked out because you were told by your teachers that you're not good at focusing, you got bad report cards, you're not able to listen. Right? Focus in our culture a lot of times is taught in the context of teaching kids to be interested in things they're not interested in. And so now, given I have a kid, and sometimes we as humans need to learn how to be interested in things I'm not interested in my utility bill, but it's good for me to know what's going on, right? And so I get it, but needless to say, a lot of us don't have positive association with this part, focus. Good news is when you're practicing mindfulness and you're focusing on the breath or on sound or the weight of your hands and your attention wanders off, as soon as you notice it and make a decision to return your attention back to the breath, you're sharpening focus. You're actually really sharpening a neural pathway in your brain. I don't know which one, probably several. I'm not a neuroscientist, but you're getting better at it. And they know this to be true, that whatever you practice gets stronger, right? I mean, we know that. You go to the gym, you do conditioning, you can get more conditioned. Same's true with focus. Same's true with that part of our attention. So I'm going to start with focus and talk about it is a skill. And the natural result is the more that we're able to recognize when our attention goes somewhere else and bring ourselves back, the less we're inundated with stressful, discursive, ruminating thoughts, right? If there's I heard one study, I don't know if this is true, that said there's 50 to 70,000 discrete thoughts that occur in one day. Sounds about right. Even if it was 10,000, that still seems like a lot. And so when we're sharpening focus, we're understanding, well, why isn't that just our naturally occurring state? Why isn't that we're just always present? And the reality is because it's actually helpful to not always be present. Because our species especially, we learned how to problem solve and think about tomorrow and think about potential pitfalls of things we could do. And so what ends up happening is, I think, our evolution selects to say, well, just do a lot of that. It seems to have gotten you here. And so our attention, I would say, this is one thing I could say maybe for certain for me, is my attention is conditioned or habituated towards thought. My attention is not conditioned and habituated towards present. It's conditioned and habituated towards thought. And the reason I know this to be true is because I've sat meditation retreat, and not only have I sat a day of retreat, or 2 days of retreat, or 3 days of retreat, I've sat a week of retreat, followed by another week, followed by another week. I've sat a month of retreat, and my attention still follows thought on week 3 of the retreat. Now, it's a lot more willing to rest in the present moment. But what's baffling is you would think, okay, man, it's been 2 weeks and all I've been doing is like focusing on my body and breath. And I would think that my mind would just be like, all right, I'm done. And it's not. So just a disclaimer if you go on retreat, that thoughts aren't going to go away. So the result is, so how does this eliminate stress? Not only does it help you to be more present, and this is really important, this is the difference between reducing stress and eliminating it, is that you're reconditioning your attention to be less habituated to thought over time. Right? So eroding away tanha, eroding away this kind of reactive drive to stimulation, your attention loves to be stimulated. It's why Blaise Pascal says we have a hard time sitting in a room quietly by ourselves. There's not a lot of stimulation. So over time, the way that mindfulness and this one skill helps to lead towards eliminating stress is it helps to unhabituate or decondition our attention towards our thinking mind. And I have noticed this to be true over time. I'm able to be more focused on being present. I'm also able to notice when I am not present more frequently. And third, kind of transitional thing as we talk about the next one, I'm able to notice more subtle levels of what's happening inside. So the reason why the Buddha taught focusing on the breath as the foundation of mindfulness, is the first foundation, is because as you get better at focus, your awareness becomes more attuned to each moment. Does that make sense? Your noticings per minute, as Joseph Goldstein calls it, goes up. That's been my experience too. So I have more moments of awareness throughout the day. And maybe you've noticed this if you've, meditated a few days in a row. It's just like you remember to be mindful throughout the day, even out of the pure intention, but also of the practice and reinforcing it. The second skill is sensory clarity. And sensory clarity is really, it's all about insight, and it's how insight helps to eliminate stress. But insight is not really the skill. The skill is sensory clarity, which in this column we would say is just awareness. So sensory clarity, which is the same as awareness, it's an ability to investigate the arising and passing of thoughts, emotions, sensations as they come and go in the present moment. But the key here is you're not actually just being aware. That's a very important part of mindfulness. And we almost have to start there, and this is maybe for people that have been practicing a little while, is that you have to start by just noticing, oh, thinking's happening right now. Right? Like I gave the instruction in the meditation, when the mind wanders, no big deal, that's what the mind does. As soon as you're aware that the mind is thinking, that is a moment of mindfulness. But we're also actually practicing noticing how one thought leads to another thought, and how an emotion that you've been experiencing is leading to a thought, or how your physical body and how you feel this morning and the drowsiness or the lethargy is influencing these other feelings, maybe the loneliness or maybe the feeling of not wanting to leave the house or the depression, or how there's this kind of connection between thoughts, feelings, emotions. Does that make sense? And so this is going to get a little deep, but it's not deep heady, it's actually deep subtle. Does that make sense? We're going to go into a really subtle level, which is your whole experience is being constructed by essentially the Buddha's classifying it in 4 things, but you could do it a lot of different ways. It's being constructed by sensation, by feeling tone, pleasant, unpleasant, neutral, by perception, by previous conditioned patterns, and by your ability to be conscious itself. And I'm not going to go into that. They're called the 5 aggregates. But the Buddha is saying that your experience is being constructed by all this internal stuff that's going on. And here's where this is really powerful and important, if you'll hang with me for a second. Why aren't we just automatically aware? There's something, the Buddha is saying, maybe we can investigate, that's causing you to lose awareness. Why did I say earlier that it's hard to be aware of a thought and we tend to get caught in the thought instead of be aware of it? And I think I've found kind of 2 things that I've noticed. Is that it's hard for me to be aware because a lot of what's automatically happening that my mind is organizing and rationalizing is drive towards pleasure and comfort and drives away from pain. And the mind is doing it all day long. You know, even when I'm sitting down and my left butt cheek hurts, I'll shift my weight to my right and I'll cross my legs so my butt cheek doesn't hurt. I'm not conscious of that. My body is just organizing itself towards comfort and pleasure and away from pain. And then again, just like there's no problem with our attention being conditioned towards thought, it probably helped us survive, there's no problem with your mind automatically orienting you towards pleasure and comfort and away from pain, except that the pleasure and the pain are never able to be locked down, right? You can never find lasting comfort. And so where there are all these ways that I'm always trying to navigate my life to fix, manage, and control things to be comfortable and avoiding things that are uncomfortable, and some of the uncomfortable things need to be dealt with, talked about, felt, cared about, shared about, tolerated, and not just ignored. And left to its own automatic impulse, my mind will move me away from discomfort and towards pleasure. And so why am I not aware? Well, because the mind is a rationalizing mind. I heard one neuroscientist say, your most recent brain, the human brain on top of your mammal and reptilian brain, they said its job is to rationalize the drives of your lower brains. Yeah, and sure, it also helped you to do things like planning into the future and organizing. But if you really investigate the planning and the organizing, a lot of it is to try to feel secure and try to feel safe and to move you towards pleasure and away from pain, right? And again, middle path. The Buddha's not saying stop doing that. He's saying be aware of it, because if you follow it automatically, you're going to endlessly, restlessly try to solve a problem you can't fix, which is this vulnerability that you're totally out of control. Moment to moment you have influence, but in the realm of impermanence, nothing's okay. And that's okay, the Buddha's saying. Nothing's okay. You're aging. The body is going to lose its functionality. You're going to die. You're going to get sick. You know, these are not things that are morbid reflections. They're actually very much truths. And that's okay. And so we try to always kind of automatically move ourselves towards comfort when maybe some of the time we could notice the tendency and say, oh, it's okay that there's not comfort here. I can be with that. Which will bring me into the last piece, but real quick I want to say another subtle level of sensory clarity, which is this idea of who you are. Andrew. Another reason we lose awareness is because the way the mind functions is it creates an abstractive narrative of reality that's disconnected from the underlying sensory reality of the moment. So I call this narrative reality. And this isn't actually a new thing. Y'all have heard this before. It's why Brene Brown's popular. Right? What does she talk about? Shame. What is shame? Unworthiness, It's a lot of these negative core beliefs. It's inadequacy. And she's trying to help us to see these kind of distortions, these stories that we live in, that we tell ourselves. The Buddha is saying, well, hold on a second. It's not just shame. It's actually the mind creates this abstracted version of I am, he calls it. And it's disconnected from the underlying sensory reality of the moment. And again, remember, just like there's no problem with us seeking comfort, there's nothing wrong with comfort, but it's the automatic, it's the unconscious. Same thing is true for this idea of Andrew. I actually have to have a sense of self, or y'all would not understand what the fuck I'm talking about. Right? If I didn't exist and you didn't exist and we were just floating around in sensory reality, we wouldn't be able to cooperate as a species. And I do not think the point of the Buddha talking about this insight of anatta, or this abstracted narrative reality, is him saying to get rid of that. He's saying, look at the automatic and unconscious way that narrative causes suffering. And we kind of move towards an abstracted narrative of our situation over just examining the situation and its complexity. So one way we get caught in this is not just the story of Andrew, but what the Buddha calls clinging to views. Right there, 2,600 years ago, one of the first fetters to awakening, right there in the Buddha's teaching, is clinging to fixed views. Not having a view, not having an opinion, clinging. Why does clinging to a view cause suffering? Because, as one of my meditation teachers used to say, for every one thing that's true, something else is also true. Multiple truths exist in sensory reality. And I'm not trying to get heady, but multiple things are true. And I'll give you an example that's hopefully palatable. It can be true to act on something in the past. I'm a person in recovery, and I hang out a lot with people in recovery, and one of the things that I do is listen to people tell their story, right, about the wreckage, basically. And there's always regret and shame. And there is a need and an ability to own the actions, and to recognize the actions, and even to recognize what led to the dishonesty or the hurt or the manipulation or whatever it was. And to really look at the truth of that's what I did and that's how I acted and this was the result. And it's painful. And it's also true that people recover. People aren't confined by that one action. Now, two truths exist at the same time. How can I own responsibility for my action with also not putting myself in the prison of my past? Because does that really help us to move forward? My experience, no. Just a simple example. Another example is you go through a breakup and you think, God, Nashville, I didn't have anyone that I'm attracted to or compatible with. Or you go through a breakup and there's the complete opposite narrative. No one is attracted to and feels like I'm compatible with them. So the Buddha says what causes suffering is not thinking of yourself as less than. There's actually a sutta around this. He says it's not thinking yourself as less than. It's not thinking of yourself as better than. It's not thinking of yourself as equal to. It's this thinking of yourself. It's this idea of I am and the abstraction that it creates and the abstraction that views create, because they limit us from the complexity of who we really are and limit us from the complexity of what our experience is actually like. So play around with it. You don't have to believe it. It's not even really an idea. It's a thing to examine. One way I like to practice this is, how is my mind fixed in a view right now about myself or the world? And how can I hold the wisdom of that view while being open to other views as well? And this has helped me a lot, y'all, because when I've really been down on myself, I shared this last time I spoke here, is one thing I'll say a lot of times is I'll say maybe. Like my mind will be like, you're a piece of shit. I'm like, maybe. I'm willing to consider it. And I'm really am, like maybe I'm a piece of shit. That's one possibility. Maybe I'm also a generous person at times. Maybe I'm a selfish person at times. Like I'm actually all of these things. I am a piece of shit. That's one of the things I am. You know? But I'm also a lot of other things. Last but not least is equanimity. Equanimity is acceptance reimagined. Equanimity is kind of the Buddhist word. It's something I love about this practice because you really only hear it in Buddhist communities. I think maybe Stoicism talks about it a little bit, but it's kind of like our word, you know? You know, if you hear someone say equanimity at the coffee shop, they're probably a Buddhist or read a Tara Brach book or something. So equanimity. Equanimity is an ability to allow sensory experience or sensory events to come and go without push or pull. And so I love this definition of acceptance because it feels more authentic to what the practice of acceptance is like. So when I've gone to people in my life that I love, that are friends, and I'm going through a hard time, and if they were to ever say a version of, well, it doesn't sound like you have any control over it, you just have to accept it and move on. Like, I hate that. You know, because that's not an event. In my experience, you can't just accept something. You have to practice accepting it. And what that practice looks like is equanimity, which means first I have to be with usually the part that I don't like. And that means that that part will be around as long as it needs to, right? Like I can't really hurry up the discomfort when I'm accepting. If I'm trying to accept to get rid of the discomfort, it's not really acceptance, it's just aversion. Again, that tanha. So there's a little bit of, and we talked about the paramis over the last couple months, and one of them is patience. Like I do think that equanimity and patience are best friends. I think acceptance and patience are best friends. And it sucks, y'all. It's like, I just have to kind of like bear with my experience and try to do so. And it's not just bearing with, it's also these qualities that are included in equanimity of loving kindness and compassion and gratitude. And there's a piece of those things aren't going to fix my discomfort sometimes. I just can be kind to myself and others and compassionate towards the pain I'm in, grateful in knowing that it's not the only thing that is happening, and try to just balance all of that out to the best of my ability. Why aren't we automatically accepting? The Buddha says because there's something fueling reactivity towards the present moment. He calls that tanha. So we're not automatically equanimous. And it's because, remember, the nervous system reflexively tenses and releases around pleasure and pain. And rather it just being, like I talked about before, a mental abstraction, a rationalization in our mind, your body hates pleasure, hates pain. So there's a level at which not even your mind is rationalizing towards pleasure and away from pain. Not only are you creating constructive narratives about yourself, your body tenses. Ugh. I noticed this has been really helpful about meditation practice, is sometimes just throughout the day being aware of my body and being like, whoa, so much tension. Just that feeling in my stomach, that I could call it anxiety, but just that sensation. You know that sensation? And there is this level in practicing mindfulness where you kind of allow the body to, you know, really surrender to the full range of the felt experience. And this is not as popular in the West. It's probably overly popular in like Japanese Zen, is like sitting with pain. And we don't talk about it a lot because like we tend to have more, and I actually heard, the Dalai Lama said this himself, we have more like self-punishment conditioning in our culture. But y'all, if you go to Myanmar, like, you want to know what they told me to do when I was sitting and walking in meditation for 16 hours a day. The instruction was to open your eyes, look at the person closest to you that's sitting as still as a statue, and say, if they can do it, I should be able to do it too. And sit with the pain longer. That was their instruction. I would never teach that to y'all. You know, but there is this level of what they're talking about is equanimity, is that actually, like, so much of that is the mind's second arrow of threat. And so long as the body's not actually in harm, and that's a good, relatively safe place to practice it, because we've sat for an hour and haven't, you know, and mostly have been fine. That's a pretty good place to practice noticing that alarm bell that the mind says, I'm going to die, and you being like, all right, let's just relax around that feeling. Let's breathe with that feeling. Those of y'all that practice yoga, this is a big part of that practice too, right? When you are in the asana and you're breathing really deeply, that's cultivating equanimity. They study this in neuroscience too. They call it the window of tolerance. So again, it's a skill. So I don't need to convince you. The Buddha says, come and see for yourself. This word, ehipassiko. Some things to look for is that maybe sometimes we're selling ourselves short on the possibilities of this practice. And that it doesn't need to be extreme. This doesn't mean, you know, if you want to and you feel inclined to meditate 4 hours a day, by all means, it's not going to hurt. But it means that remember every moment that you're driving in the car and you just pause the podcast and take a breath and notice your thought. That's a powerful moment. And it's leading towards eroding away that tanha, that reflexive tendency. Every moment you notice the story your mind's telling yourself about you or some fixed view that it's having, rather than saying I shouldn't be having that right now, which is just another form of aversion, saying, oh, maybe, interesting, look at that. That's one version. Maybe I'm a piece of shit, maybe I'm other things too. And every moment we're aware, every moment we're present, every moment we're willing to sit with some discomfort and to be open to the possibility that it is not always going to kill us. Of course, if it is, get out of the way. We're sharpening equanimity.
What's up, y'all? Reverend Mikey Noshel here from Wild Heart Meditation Center in Nashville, Tennessee. Thanks for checking us out. Do me a favor, please like and subscribe. And if you feel moved to leave a donation, you can do so at wildheartmeditationcenter.org or the Venmo link in the description. Peace and love.